What's going on, guys? We got a very exciting video. We've got a new Happy Army video about the most recent UAP drops from the US government. So this is going to be sick. I started recording this video earlier today and the power went out and I lost the footage. So I saw like the first couple of minutes and I'll tell you right now, this is going to be crazy, dude. So buckle up, get your coffee, get your water, get your beer, whatever it is. Sorry. And let's get after it. First, please like, share, subscribe. You guys, we're on the road to 50,000 subs. Let's get there, huh? What else? We got our t-shirts, Anti-Putin Social Club with the big anti-Putin on the back. Super A type personality t-shirt. It's one of those t-shirts that you could end up getting in a confrontation by wearing, and that happens to be some of my favorite type of apparel to wear. So if you're like that, grab one. Link in description. Discord link in description. Let's go.
Documents and videos from the FBI. The Pentagon just released their fifth and most insane batch of UFO files yet, declassifying hundreds of documents and videos from the FBI, CIA, and State Department onto their website, which claims that these UFOs are now increasingly becoming a national security threat. The disclosure from this newest August 2026 release that you need to know about comes from a Special Forces live fire training event that happened over the Gulf of Oman in 2021. Now, the report states, quote, the AC-130 gunship observed two approximately 4-foot diameter cold orbs between 0 to 20 feet above the surface of the water, and the aircraft clocked their maneuvering speed at 1,300 miles per hour. No means of propulsion were observed. So for context, that means that these objects were moving as fast as a fighter jet, while at the same time maneuvering impossibly quick with hairpoint turns. Something was doing circles around our best weapon systems out there. Because the report states the AC-130 combat systems officer then fired his 105mm cannon at the UAP, but the UAP rapidly flew away during the slight delay between when he pulled the trigger and the cannon's recoil, almost as if the UAP knew that the shot was coming. But an even more shocking account from the file release comes to us from a US pilot who reported seeing a strange, massive triangle-shaped craft that blocked out the stars over Afghanistan in 2002.
How many of you watching this have a family member, friend, or maybe even personally have seen this image right here? Not seen this image, but seen one of these triangular things in the sky. I have not personally, but my dad tells the story all the time about seeing one of these over our old house in Nevada and walking outside and seeing it just come over. And he said it blacked out the stars. It was dead quiet. It's pretty crazy. It's one of those stories that you could tell it had such a profound effect on him that it affected me all the way from childhood up until now that I remember this. And I also remember because he would tell me that his dad, my grandpa, saw one over the Lake Tahoe area. Massive triangle just hovering over Lake Tahoe. So I'm curious if you guys have family members who have seen this too.
He said in the release files, quote, at approximately 4:30 a.m. local time, Redacted noticed that the stars were getting blacked out over Bagram. It appeared as if something huge went overhead, from west to east, and was an equilateral triangle shape. The object was moving silently, at a consistent speed and altitude, possibly 150 knots, with no lights visible. He went on to say that he estimated it was 500 feet in size, but he could not fully see the shape of the object. The story was corroborated by another pilot that was there with him. And for context, that's massive. It's like a 50-story building laid on its side, or a football field and a half in size, this craft up in the sky. No wonder they waited over 2 decades to declassify that story, because it sounds totally insane. But these reports remind me of the kind of stories that me and the guys would trade when we were killing time during our deployment in Iraq. And that's what's always fascinated me, is just how much in common these encounters seem to have. Almost everyone knows somebody who has a story. Some of the stories might have routine explanations, others can be explained by foreign adversaries, but there are still incidents that fall outside of these explanations. From the war in Ukraine to the global war on terror, I want to investigate the most credible reports from the UFO files, including bizarre metallic jellyfish and
I love this stuff so much, dude. I'm such a nerd when it comes to this stuff.
Invading our skies, strange beings appearing on thermals at nuclear sites, to something draining animals' blood at US installations all across America. But the next story is even more bizarre, I think, and it comes to us from the war in Ukraine. One night in February 2024, Ukrainian artillery troops were scanning the battlefield looking for Russian enemies with a DJI Mavic drone when something strange appeared on their thermal display. Suspended above the horizon was a dark, elongated object. It had no immediately recognizable wings, no rotors or tail, and it appeared almost motionless as the drone operator watched. The footage was attributed to Ukraine's 406th Separate Artillery Brigade and quickly spread online, being reported widely, including in Newsweek. In the recordings, the soldiers sound just as confused as everyone who later watched it. One jokingly asks why the object isn't firing missiles at them, which is a reasonable concern when you're fighting a war where practically everything in the sky eventually tries to kill you. The object's actual distance was impossible to determine from the video alone. It could have been a relatively small object nearby, or something enormous much further away. And as a former infantryman, I'm legally required to say at this point that estimating range by staring at something on a screen is exactly how confident people end up being confidently wrong. But I think that uncertainty here is where the story becomes even stranger. In 2025, 3 Ukrainian researchers then published an analysis of the footage by estimating that the object was approximately 88 kilometers from the drone and 8 kilometers above the ground. They calculated that it traveled roughly 14 kilometers in 17 seconds. An insane 800 meters per second, or around Mach 2.5. Their broader research suggests that some dark objects detected over Ukraine could measure several kilometers across. In dummy, Barney-style terminology that I can understand, Ukraine filmed a floating island moving faster than the speed of sound, or somebody made a very consequential mistake when estimating the range. The second possibility can't be ignored, and astrophysicist Avi Loeb had previously challenged similarly extraordinary conclusions from the same Ukraine research program. His argument was by overestimating the distance, an ordinary nearby object can suddenly look like a gigantic craft traveling at impossible speed. So his criticism concerned earlier observations, not this specific footage, but
I mean, if there's anybody that I would trust anyone that I would believe that says there's something abnormal, it would be these Ukrainian drone operators, because they see everything, and they have gotten so proficient and so good at recognizing different types of drones, different types of enemy craft. I mean, these guys will be flying at 100 kilometers an hour in an FPV and see 3 pixels move in the brush off to the left and stop, turn, and then smoke somebody, right? I mean, these guys, I've not only worked with these guys, but been in a lot of their drone positions, and they're next level, dude. I definitely don't think that they would even consider bringing something up to their command or intelligence saying, hey, we don't know what this is, if they really didn't know.
the same basic problem applies here, because without a reliable distance measurement, every other math calculation becomes questionable. I once watched an entire squad in Iraq argue over whether a distant object was a person, a bush, or a cow. It was a cow. So I'm reluctant to declare that a thermal silhouette is an alien battleship without a little more supporting evidence. But years into one of the most heavily surveilled wars in human history, nobody has produced a conclusive explanation for exactly what those Ukrainian troops were looking at that day. The next most credible encounter I could find in the Pentagon's UFO files.
The only thing I could consider that would debunk that specific image right here is that that's because it's obviously cloudy or foggy in that region, that could be a shadow or shadow of a different type of craft. But even then, what is it a shadow of? That leads to the question, what is making that shadow? Because that would be just as concerning as the shadow itself.
That day. The next most credible encounter I could find in the Pentagon's UFO files comes from late 2025, very recently, from the second batch of files that were released. The location is still classified, and the report was written by an unnamed, anonymous senior US intelligence officer whose identity still remains a secret, but for the purposes of the story recounting it, we'll call him Lieutenant Carl. And what you're looking at right here is his actual sworn statement made to the US government and released publicly on the Department of War website. The event is a UFO invasion of the US government weapons test range, as we'll see, because according to his recently declassified intelligence report, our senior intelligence officer, Lieutenant Carl, had been dispatched to a weapons test range somewhere in the United States, likely in the Nevada test range or the Utah training range or White Sands. But Lieutenant Carl's mission was to get to the bottom of a series of strange or White Sands.
Little fun fact for you guys, since we never actually see Nevada on a map. I was born over here in Reno, Nevada, which is right over here in this little elbow. Las Vegas is all the way down here. I ended up coming down to Las Vegas after high school and went to UNLV for a while, dropped out, blah blah blah. But these were my old stomping grounds until I moved to Texas when COVID started.
But Lieutenant Carl's mission was to get to the bottom of a series of strange UAP-related events that had been plaguing the facility as of late. According to the personnel at the facility, they've been hearing loud thuds somewhere in the mountains that ring the test range. And this coincided with the appearance of luminous UAPs, which were often actually tracked on radar. That's enough to make me need to sleep in my battle buddy's bunk at night. On the day in question, though, Lieutenant Carl, the intelligence officer, was surveying the mountains where the loud thuds in the UAPs had been heard and seen, likely looking for a point of origin where a foreign adversary might have been launching these exotic drones from. Lieutenant Carl's sworn statement says, quote, "After leaving the JOC, we flew a low-altitude nap of the Earth route through the mountain range for several hours. Multiple times, we spotted debris on the ground and descended for closer inspection. Each time, we determined it was remnants from rockets and other projectiles that had crashed during years of weapons testing." End quote. After several hours of searching for anything that could explain the orb-like sightings, the chopper ran low on fuel, and Lieutenant Carl had to make a decision to meet up with a tanker aircraft for a quick refueling. This tells us that he was probably using a Black Hawk helicopter equipped with a special refueling probe, possibly a Pave Hawk, and what that tells us is that his craft would have given him access to heavy-duty surveillance gear that's on board those. And it was about to reveal a literal nightmare scenario that would have had me medically discharged for trauma. Because shortly after refueling, the local Joint Operations Center, the JOC, radioed in a request for the helicopter. Lieutenant Carl's helicopter was sent to investigate debris discovered by a ground team that was nearby, thinking it might offer a clue to the strange craft being observed at the test range. Lieutenant Carl's helicopter quickly was retasked even as the sun set, which forced them to use night vision and FLIR equipment to navigate according to them. But suddenly, the headquarters radioed with an immediate alert. Radar operators had just detected several strange objects just a few miles away from their position. Objects that had mysteriously appeared in the same exact place that ground personnel had reported UFOs in the nights prior.
See, this is crazy, and I don't know if this is real footage or not, because you can see the ground team, if this is the footage related to what he's talking about. You could see the ground team moving right near, just south of the crosshairs on the middle of the screen. Then obviously you have this fuzzball floating across the screen. This would be crazy if this was real.
Well, Lieutenant Carl states in his report, quote, "I relayed this to our pilots, and we altered course to intercept. As the helicopter raced to close in on the radar contacts, ground teams over there already started to report a UAP that was spotted with their FLIR thermal devices. The ground teams radioed in saying that the object was super hot, flying low to the ground, and moving east before abruptly changing course south at high speed. Then it seemingly disappeared. Upon arriving, the helicopter initiated a ground search, utilizing night vision, its FLIR, and just good old-fashioned the naked eye. After doing several passes, though, that nearby ground team radioed in a dire warning to Lieutenant Carl's helicopter and the crew. They said that the UAP had reappeared, and it had apparently dropped down to the ground upon the helicopter's arrival and remained out of sight. But it was now rising and shooting straight at the helicopter, according to the ground team. The UAP was described as stopping just 10 feet shy of turning the helicopter into a very expensive paperweight. Then it shot away at high speed from the pilot's point of view. Then the UAP split into two smaller objects before accelerating out of sight, according to the quote. At this point, the rest of this mission would have been a big nope for me.
This is
Just give me
insane,
insurgents and IEDs in Iraq any day. But apparently made of sterner
20, 30 years ago, if you were to bring something up like this to, I don't know, a group of people, they would tell you that you need to see a psychologist, a psychiatrist, you need to get your head checked. And these are credible military professionals. Some of these are top level commanders. I mean, this is nuts, dude.
stuff than me. The helicopter crew and Lieutenant Carl, who had just nearly been smashed out of the sky by this UAP, decided to give chase. However, they were forced to give up when they couldn't match its speed. Sometime during the chase, the headquarters radioed in that several fighter aircraft on a training mission had entered the range, and they were quickly retasked with pursuing and identifying this unknown object. Soon, they would have their own terrifying encounter. Meanwhile, though, the helicopter was reassigned to several more nearby radar detections. Arriving at a nearby mountain, Lieutenant Carl and his team and the helicopter settled into a hover about 700 feet above the ground, according to him, only for the world's most terrifying light show to start up right in front of them. According to Lieutenant Carl, our senior intelligence officer's statement, he and the helicopter crew observed countless orange orbs absolutely swarming the nearby mountain. The orbs put on their light show for several minutes in full view of the helicopter crew, and we have to assume that all of this was being recorded by the chopper's equipment. So somewhere buried deep in the Pentagon's black vault, they have classified high-definition video footage of all of this event. Presumably, though, as quickly as it started, it seemed to fade away, leaving the crew in stuns.
That's what I always think, man. If this is the stuff they're willing to show us, imagine the stuff that they're not. Boy, they got like a whole alien colony somewhere locked down, and they're doing tests on them or something, man. I swear.
Silence. But whatever was behind this phenomena wasn't done playing with them just yet. Almost as soon as the light show ended, the headquarters reported fresh radar hits again at a previous location where they'd almost been swatted out of the sky by the UAP. Upon arriving, they hovered again at about 700 feet altitude and watched as two large orbs, visible now by the naked eye, suddenly flared up just to the right of the helicopter, described as oval-shaped and orange with white or yellow center. The orbs emitted a bright light in all directions and seemingly had no identifying propulsion, because after a few seconds, according to the report, a third orb flared to life below them, and then a fourth below it until they formed a T formation right behind the helicopter. So if you've been tracking the Pentagon UAP file releases, this probably sounds very familiar to you, because it's exactly what was reported in 1945 by American pilots over the skies of Europe during World War II. So the latest extreme close encounter proved unnerving enough that the pilots and Lieutenant Carl openly debated landing the aircraft for safety reasons. However, they reached deep for that last bit of hula motivation, and they opted instead to remain hovering. Then Lieutenant Carl said, quote, "We spotted the fighter jets entering visual range at 23,000 feet. Suddenly, the exact same orbs appeared right above the inbound fighters, perfectly matching the jet's speed and flight path, almost as if they could predict exactly where they were going." Lieutenant Carl in his report said that the strange lights then dimmed in reverse order of appearance, exactly like they had with the helicopter. They hounded the fighters until the last aircraft left the airspace and proceeded to land at a nearby airfield. According to the report, it appeared as if the lights were chasing the aircraft as they transited overhead, but with the fighters gone, the lights returned to their old plaything and soon were lighting up the helicopter again. For several minutes, the lights would flare up around the helicopter until at last the bizarre light show ended.
That's one thing that's so crazy to me. I know I'm pausing it a lot, man, but this is just fascinating to me. That's another thing that's so crazy is these aren't just freak couple of seconds or couple millisecond instances where people like saw something out of the corner of their eye. These things are just chilling there, hanging out with them for minutes.
With the lights forming a triangle shape and then dimming for good. Low on fuel, Lieutenant Carl and his helicopter returned back to the base and landed with their crew, trying to decipher what in the world or out of the world they'd just seen. Was it a threat display? An attempt to communicate? Because to me, the lights seem to be saying it's time to switch jobs and never go to that airfield again. That's theirs now. Sorry, air travel, we had a good ride, but this is one of the most high-profile incidents.
And this is, I know, I did it again. The idea that the if this is some kind of an extraterrestrial intelligent life form, right? The idea that they would have any hostile um posture towards humanity to me is silly because in my perspective, violence against each other and warfare against each other is a very primitive level humanity is it's a low level of humanity existence. I think when civilizations become what we would consider to be ultra intelligent, very, very smart, there is no need for this type of violence. There's no need for these kinds of wars, stuff like that. You kind of transcend. Again, this is my theory, but at a certain point of intelligence, I think you transcend violence and war, and I believe that would be the case for this kind of a intelligent life form. But let's say for some reason they were hostile. You think these things would have any issue annihilating what's going anything that we have going on? Who here has saw that video of I think it was a tomahawk hitting one of these cold orbs out in the middle of the sea, and it just shed it off. It literally like the tomahawk just blasted into it and then veered off, and like parts were floating around. It was really strange, but my point is these things are so advanced. If they wanted us dead or hurt, they probably would have done it.
To ever be documented in official US government correspondence, at least that we know of. If such a bizarre and high-profile incident happened right under the noses of every single American, though, one has to wonder what other insane things the military might be hiding. One of the most disturbing and most credible accounts comes from a group of US Marines, local residents, and a British journalist who all came forward and spoke on the record with their full names to the New York Times about what they witnessed. In Helmand province, one of the most bloody regions of the war in Afghanistan, a small group of US Marines were occupying a hilltop position, observing Taliban activity that was moving through the surrounding area in 2009. It was isolated and exposed. The hilltop defensive position that they were on was already ancient at the time, having been used in wars from the Soviet Union to when the British Empire was in Afghanistan. So the Marines who were first occupying it in 2008 discovered strange small tunnels leading into chambers beneath their mound on the outpost. But before they could fully understand what this underground tunnel structure was, they had engineers come in with demolition charges, blow it up, and collapse the tunnels. It was done as a safety precaution to make sure no one snuck in behind them and that no Taliban was able to flank them. Local residents later explained that these tunnels may have originated from a spiritual site and a burial ground from centuries ago, stretching back to ancient times before Alexander the Great's conquest through there. Shortly after arriving, the Marines started digging defensive positions. And almost immediately, they started uncovering human remains. It gets even stranger from there, because the US Marines described bones being scattered throughout the ground beneath the outpost. According to local stories, the hill had been associated with death long before the American deployment ever arrived. Some accounts claim that it had served as a burial ground following earlier battles and massacres here in Afghanistan.
To me, that makes sense, right? It's also here in Ukraine, in lands where they're super ancient, super old, thousands of years old. There's burial sites everywhere, dude. I mean, in the village I live in, you could probably start digging in any portion of the village and eventually run into a body or remains or something. And humans have been burying each other burying their dead for thousands of years, if not tens of thousands.
The British troops that the US Marines replaced gave them a strangely specific piece of advice as they were leaving to go back home. They said to the Marines that if they dug up anything, they needed to put it back in the ground where they found it, implying that it was cursed. But that's when the strange reports started happening. US Marines standing watch in this outpost described hearing random footsteps moving throughout empty fighting positions. Others reported their radios filling with unexplained interference, or voices when nobody was even transmitting over the waves. Corporal Dutch Perkins and others claimed that they could hear men speaking Russian somewhere just beyond the perimeter. They felt like they weren't alone while standing watch. The outpost guard, known as Ugly Betty, started barking at apparently empty areas outside the position. But it got even stranger from there. The Marines also reported sudden temperature drops, the smell of decomposition, and unexplained flashes in the surrounding darkness that resembled distant muzzle fire but were not followed by any actual shots. One of the most disturbing accounts involved the Marines scanning the terrain with night vision equipment, and one night, he reportedly saw what appeared to be a human figure approaching the outpost. The Marines switched from night vision to thermal imaging, but there was no heat signature in front of him. When he switched back to night vision, suddenly the figure had appeared to have moved significantly closer to him. What gives this story more credibility, though, I think from an average barracks ghost tale, is that several Marines stationed at the same position later described overlapping experiences to New York Times journalists, including giving their own names, which sets it apart from the usual anonymous posts on the internet. So for instance, Marine Jose Herrera later described OP Rock as a possible conduit for paranormal activity, but there are also very reasonable explanations here. I think these Marines were operating in a combat zone under intense pressure, surviving on limited sleep while constantly watching for enemy movement. The psychological impact of discovering human remains under you could have contributed to all of this as well, because human perception is imperfect, even under the most normal of conditions. But I wasn't there, so who am I to pass judgment on the eyewitness accounts? What we do know is that these Marines believe they encountered something out there that they couldn't identify. But this is only the tip of the crazy iceberg.
In my opinion, man, I've been in situations with, as a soldier with other soldiers here in Ukraine where ideas start floating around and everybody kind of gets into this mind space, into this headspace of paranormal creepiness. Like, you know, you start sharing ghost stories and all of a sudden somebody's like, "What was that? You guys hear that over there?" Blah blah blah. But at the same time, I've been on positions where you're under constant threat the whole time. And theoretically, if you weren't in a war zone, it would be scary, right? It's pitch black, you're alone, blah blah blah. But you're never even thinking about that kind of stuff because your mind's going 1,000 miles an hour because you're trying to survive. And so you're not even letting your brain go to like the paranormal spooky stuff. So if you were pulled out of this survival fight or flight instinct that you have when you're on a position, if you were pulled out of this and put into a, what was that, right? Like a paranormal freaked out mode, to me that holds more credit because it's really hard to put yourself in that mind space willingly when you're trying to focus on just surviving the enemy drones and everything, right? Your mind's not even anywhere near paranormal stuff. You're just like, oh my God, am I gonna live? So if you were pulled away from that and into, was that a ghost? That says something to me.
Because things are about to get a lot.
But if you're bored on a position where there hasn't been anything happening for days or weeks, maybe you don't necessarily have that fight or flight instinct that's going on, so your mind starts to wander, you start seeing or hearing different things.
A lot weirder. Nuclear weapons are a magnet for the paranormal if you don't already know it. From UFOs to shadow beings and other things that go bump in the night, it seems the spooky world is absolutely obsessed with nuclear fission for some reason. There's such a big magnet that when he worked with AARO, UFO whistleblower Luis Elizondo said that the organization had proposed creating a UFO trap by concentrating a bunch of nuclear assets in one area and then, I don't know, demasking them Scooby-Doo style? The US government was so concerned about UFOs that they were trying to lure them in, because the easiest way to catch a UFO, as we all know, is to build the universe's most radioactive bird feeder. The plan was to use an aircraft carrier because of its already large nuclear signature thanks to its 2 nuclear reactors on board. The carrier could have then been loaded with nuclear bombs and accompanied by other nuclear assets like ballistic missiles and attack submarines. It would have been an end-of-the-world party to end all end-of-the-world parties. It would have been an Armageddon if literally anything went wrong. But sadly for those wanting to lure UFOs in close enough to, I guess, spring a net over them, the plan was considered but not approved. That likely had a lot to do with the fact that moving that much nuclear firepower into one location would have made certain adversarial nations like China, Russia, pretty nervous. I'm on pretty good terms with the United States myself, and it would have made me kind of nervous. There's still plenty to investigate with nuclear power, though. Our next incident might be one of the most concerning that I could dig up about the UFO Pentagon files and nuclear power, because for decades, those who have worked with everything from nuclear missiles to nuclear power plants have reported the same eerie phenomena, from shadowy figures that seem to disappear when pursued and glowing balls of light. A lot like our first report earlier, but what happens when something biological penetrates one of the world's most restricted areas? In a 2025 News Nation interview with investigative journalist Ross Colbert, a former U.S. Air Force Security Forces patrolman recounts a hair-raising incident that happened at Nellis Air Force Base by two
Las
nuclear
Vegas.
weapons storage depots, with a second witness confirmed by Colbert, who did not want to appear on camera. At the time of the incident, the facility's security personnel were undergoing a training exercise. In this specific scenario, the 30-man security element had to respond to a penetration alarm from inside of an empty training structure, prompting a large armed response. Upon arriving on scene, the assault force started to form up in anticipation of entering into the bunker to eliminate this simulated threat. But they were interrupted by a radio call from an Overwatch patrol, stating that they had been spotted by two individual heat signatures on their thermals in the desert in front of the training structure. The figures appeared to be humanoid in shape and laying flat on the ground.
What?
But with no perimeter penetration alarms or any other cause for concern, the unseen forces assumed that they were fellow flight members out there, picked to be bad guys and already part of this training exercise. With custody over nuclear weapons being priority to literally everything else, the two perps in the field were ignored to focus on assault and recovery operations. But then everything changed. Shortly after the warning radio call came in, the flight sergeant and senior-most security figure asked for the reporting patrol to repeat what they had observed. Once again, they relayed that they had eyes on two individuals that appeared to be laying prone, watching the exercise unfold in front of them, clearly visible on their handheld FLIR devices. The flight sergeant called for an immediate exercise termination and initiated a real-world security response at that point, indicating that he hadn't put out any individuals out there. So what happened next would end up being reported all the way to the highest levels of the Pentagon and would result in one of the nation's most traumatic training events. Something or someone had just penetrated into the world's largest above-ground nuclear weapons storage depot and had not set off a single alarm. The security personnel immediately formed into a sweep element with multiple M240 and M249 machine guns overwatching them. Whoever was out there was facing more firepower than some third world nations' entire militaries, and they'd given these American troops good reason to use it. As perimeter signs clearly state, once you pass the outer fence, deadly force is authorized. And when it comes to mysterious beings out there who only appear on thermal devices, it's preferred, really. The sweeping element uses a combination of night vision, FLIR, and good old-fashioned Mark I eyeballs, but failed to detect anything. It was only the overwatching machine gun team, with their elevated position, who could clearly see the two figures on their thermals, and they appeared to be responding to the sweep, closing in on them. As the element came closer and closer, the figures started moving backwards on their bellies, clearly showing signs that they were responding to the security personnel who were closing in on them. Whatever the figures were, they didn't want to get caught, and so they pulled off a vanishing act by disappearing right off the thermals that were trained on them. Once the sweeping element got to within a few meters of where the figures were, they evaded multiple surveillance devices. Baffled, the sweep pushed past the last known position to make sure that they weren't dealing with something that had just camouflaged its body heat and then repositioned. However, given the proximity of the troops to the last known position, it should have been impossible for anyone to run or crawl away. But other than confirming residual heat left on the ground by the sweep's own FLIR devices and some scuff marks that were apparent on the hard desert floor, the two mysterious figures had left with no other trace. Somebody or something had just penetrated into what should have been the most secure place on Earth and disappeared without a trace. But this next story is just as bizarre. This
That's crazy, dude. Like, how do you even rationalize these things? And that's the purpose of these releases, right? These files that are being released are the unexplained, the files that cannot be explained, right? Or part of that archive. They've gone through and found the ones that could be explained. Oh, it's a shadow. Oh, it was friendly forces. It was this. It was that. It was this. The ones the government's releasing are UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomenon, or I guess that wasn't aerial, but
Jellyfish UFO was famously filmed in action somewhere close to Al Tak Air Base in Iraq in 2017.
this is one of the craziest videos I've ever seen when it comes to UFO stuff.
With the use of thermals, they filmed the unknown object, and it's captured in surprisingly high detail here, with numerous appendages visible in some of the sequences. The object is filmed for a whopping 17 minutes from an Air Force protection aerostat, and it silently hovers over the entire facility before continuing without incident. From its silent locomotion, no discernible means of propulsion, and enough appendages to make an octopus blush, the Iraqi jellyfish drone, which is not to be confused with the Iranian one, is a big old nope for me. Skeptics have struck back, saying that the object was likely just a bunch of balloons tethered together, or simply a smudge on the camera. However, in the footage, the object does not remain in the same spot on the camera, making it impossible to just be a smudge. And as far as party balloons, the lack of tumbling, cohesion, and no movement from the dangling appendages makes that very unlikely, as does the fact that the base personnel were apparently aware of multiple overflights of the jellyfish UFO, meaning this was not a one-time incident. Theories have ranged on these odd pyramid and jellyfish objects being increasingly spotted by militaries and civilians. Digging into the historical record, though, it seems that these jellyfish UFOs are a relatively recent phenomena. They didn't appear in the known historical accounts until after the 2010s. What we do have are objects described as broadly jellyfish-shaped, but not with the same distinct presence of numerous appendages dangling below like a big old sky weirdo. The first flying jellyfish report comes from the crew of the Stratocruiser, who watched a large, dark object accompanied by 6 smaller objects for nearly 20 minutes. According to the witnesses, the larger object seemed to be shape-shifting and described it as the shape of a jellyfish swimming through the water. The strongest visual parallel, though, comes from a Soviet-Russian TASS news report from 1977, which actually drew intense attention from CIA reports. So this TASS report says that at 0400 hours on September 22nd, 1977, the town of Petrozavodsk was awakened by the sudden appearance of a huge star suddenly flaring up in the sky. The star moved slowly toward the city and then spread its long tendrils out around it, showering the city with fine rays, which gave the appearance of kind of like rainfall. Some have commented that the UFO could be a different type of biology that we don't understand, which might have made this rain fall from this UFO. The possibilities there are endless and disgusting, with all this biological rain coming from a UFO. But it was observed by dock workers and military personnel. The rays eventually ceased, and the object turned into a bright semicircle, according to them, and moved toward nearby Lake Onaga. The horizon was then shrouded in a gray cloud, which had a semicircle pool of bright light, red in the middle and white at the sides, forming its shape. After a total length of 10 to 12 minutes, the object disappeared into the horizon, leaving behind it no traces of its passing. According to the director of meteorological observation in the town, the event was inexplicable but impossible to deny. Due to the sheer number of witnesses and the widely dispersed location of the witnesses, it makes it impossible for this to have been some kind of mirage or hallucination. Whatever these jellyfish UFOs are, we can't rule out 2 possibilities. I think they're either an extremely exotic new form of UAV that entered service in the early 2010s, or they represent something non-human that either recently took on this appearance or could possibly be a new agent on the world stage. From the UFOs to something terrifying on the ground this time, an occurrence so gnarly it spawned a full-blown FBI investigation, because on April 24th, 1978, near a sensitive U.S. defense facility in New Mexico, rancher Manuel Gomez contacted the state police after finding his 11-month-old bull dead and mutilated. Mutilation came hot on the heels of a wave of similar cattle mutilations across the American South and Midwest, and the proximity to military and government contractor installations had made many people very suspicious of the government being involved. The horror show that they often discovered made it clear that regular animal predators didn't do this. The bull in question was found in the same condition that previous mutilations had been found in, a lack of blood around the mutilation site, and some of the organs were removed. It's gross, I'll put it that way. And it was done with impossibly sharp, precise instruments. But the body appeared to be significantly dehydrated, as if the bull's internal water permeating its tissues and organs had somehow been vacuumed and sucked away. 4 impressions were discovered about 100 feet from where the carcass was, as if a hovering craft had descended and rested on 4 separate landing legs. The possible landing impressions, however, were unusually deep given the very hard, very dry ground there, which gave investigators the idea that whatever this object must have been, it was extremely heavy. It also appears that part of the landing apparatus or the object itself had scraped along the ground as it landed or took off. Other than possible landing imprints, there were no tire tracks or footprints that were ever found anywhere near the carcass. Extensive bruising was discovered around one of the animal's legs, which gave Gomez the idea that a strap of some sort had been wrapped around it and used to lift the animal into the sky. But lassoing a bull by the leg while leaving no evidence on the ground is like playing the claw game with both eyes closed. To show you how seriously the US government was taking this case, the animal's heart, samples from its muscles, and fragments of bones were sent to the Los Alamos National Laboratory, the same place where America basically invented the Fallout franchise in 1945. So Los Alamos reported nothing abnormal other than bacteria believed to have entered the body of the animal after death, with no conclusion useful in determining the animal's death there. Exactly what a laboratory might say, though, if they were trying to hide some secret cattle tests. Part of the animal were also sent to private labs, which curiously withheld their full findings unless sufficient evidence was gathered to prosecute any kind of responsible party. We talked to a modern-day academic working in a high-powered lab today, and she explained that this is speech intended to protect the private labs. So translated into everyday average infantryman talk, what the labs found was something anomalous. But unless the FBI was ready to slap the cuffs on someone, they weren't willing to publicly divulge what they had found. It was a move meant to basically protect the reputation of the lab and the discovery process. So strange and out of the ordinary that unless a culprit was discovered, the labs simply weren't willing to bear public ridicule for stating their results, which is exactly the opposite of how science should work. But the New Mexico State Police believed that the culprits had been very well financed, with access to advanced technology capable of sedating and airlifting cattle. An officer investigating the case believed that anticoagulants were likely administered to make it easier to do this to the animal's carcass, and some of the more inappropriate aspects of the bull's organs were removed with surgical tools, so the discovery of some light pink stains under the animal was theorized to have been the result of some kind of radiation weapon, or a radiation device of some kind, with the radiation destroying the red blood cells and thus leaving the blood pink. No culprit was ever named, though, but the phenomena has not just occurred near sensitive national defense installations. It's also happened across civilian ranches all over the Midwest and American Southwest. This has been observed, and they continue to this day. So I'm not sure what I believe here. If these are adversarial technologies from China or Russia that we don't know about, that are more advanced and can do things that we're not familiar with, or if this is something underworldly or just mistakes, accidentally seen signatures on radar screens that weren't really there. But if you found this video valuable, check out this video we have on some of the Pentagon's previous file dumps that are absolutely terrifying. I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy.
Please check out Cappy's channel, you guys. He is the GOAT, man. I'm very, very curious with your guys' take on this stuff, man. You guys know I find it very fascinating, very interesting, so I'm a little biased, right? I want to believe. Even though I will also try to debunk things if I see it, right? If I'm like, because I truly want to believe. I don't want to fictitiously believe, right? So I really wonder what you guys think. I think there's stuff going on, and I do believe that as humanity becomes more technologically advanced, we'll start seeing more strange things. I also think the government has so much information on this stuff that we don't know, that they're not going to share with us or just haven't yet, whatever. One thing I find really interesting, though, is that on Earth, 71% of Earth is made up of water, of oceans, right? Less than 80, or no, 80% of world's oceans have never been explored. So think about those numbers real quick. The majority of Earth is water. The vast majority of that water has never been explored. What is down there? If I was an alien, which I might be, that's where I would hide. If I had the technology and the ability, and I was supposed to be staying on Earth for whatever reason to, observe this human experiment that's happening, that's where I would stay, in the ocean. I wouldn't stay in a land base somewhere where there's always somebody with a video camera or somebody driving on a dirt bike, or you know what I mean? Love this stuff, dude. Yes. All right. Please like, share, subscribe. This is a longer video. I've been getting a lot of comments asking for longer content like this, so hopefully you like this one. I love you guys. We'll see you in the next one.